The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is a proud supporter of Indian Country Today. Students at Cronkite News and Gaylord College at the University of Oklahoma cover Indigenous communities together. This important work is distributed by more than 100 news organizations. This collaboration provides a much-needed boost to coverage of Native American communities nationwide. Learn more at cronkitenews.azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalahungva. Democracy is strongest in our country when everyone participates. That's what Vice President Kamala Harris said as she met with leaders from across Indian country. It included leadership from the Oglala tribe, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, the Alaska Federation of Natives, and groups that advocate for Native voting rights. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland was also at the meeting. Vice President Harris acknowledged, quote, a long-standing and recent issue around attempts to interfere with all people's right to vote. One example that was brought up involved the Navajo Nation. Its lands cross 3 counties in Arizona, and each one has different voting rules, making it difficult to get the right information out to residents on the reservation. And a recent Supreme Court ruling on Arizona voting laws isn't helping alleviate those concerns. In her opening remarks, Vice President Harris talked about how the current administration is working with tribes.
We have been engaged with consultations with the tribes and tribal leaders in recognition of the government-to-government relationship and in recognition, therefore, of the need to consult with these leaders to make sure that whatever it is that we are doing to fix the problems, it is informed by what the leaders.
Native Americans were not universally granted U.S. citizenship and the right to vote until 1924 with the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act. Even then, states still barred Native Americans from voting for decades. Tribes in Arizona and New Mexico didn't get the right to vote until 1948. Well, her ancestors invented surfing, and now Carissa Moore is the Olympic gold medal winner. Moore made double history as the sport made its Olympic debut. She's the only Native Hawaiian competing in the sport created again by her ancestors. Moore is 28 years old and says it took her time to adjust to the smaller waves in Japan, as well as not having any family around to support her at the Olympics. This is video of her practicing last month for the World Surf League competition in Lemoore, California. She says she usually competes under the Hawaiian flag and will wear it in her heart during the Olympics. Duke Kahanamoku, who is considered the godfather of modern surfing, petitioned the International Olympic Committee to include surfing in the Games. That was in 1912. It took more than 100 years to include surfing in the Olympics. Fires continue to pummel tribes in the Pacific Northwest. The Colville tribes in Washington are currently monitoring 2 separate blazes. The Chewiah Creek fire, which has burned 36,000 acres, is now 65% contained. Firefighters continue to monitor and patrol the fire's perimeter. All evacuation orders have been lifted, roads are back open, and no water drops were needed on Monday. Those air resources are now supporting firefighting at the Summit Trail fire, which has burned nearly 14,000 acres. It's only 6% contained. Tribal officials have closed the reservation to the public. Lightning caused both wildfires. Plans to search for remains at 2 Native American boarding schools in Colorado are being made. Fort Lewis College opened more than a century ago. The Denver Post reports the old campus of Fort Lewis in Hesperus and the Teller Indian School in nearby Grand Junction are going to be investigated for remains of Native children who attended and may have died at those institutions. They are the only former boarding schools in the state. Fort Lewis College President Tom Strakas says the school's history needs to be discussed and not kept hidden. He has reached out to local tribal leaders to involve them in the process. First Lady Dr. Jill Biden made a stop in Anchorage on her way to the Olympic Games in Tokyo. Biden has been to Alaska before, and she's been told the state is a model for an effective, coordinated response to COVID-19. During her 2-hour visit last week, the First Lady talked about health services and support for Alaska Natives, Alaskans, and military families. Tribal health leaders told her about achievements and problems in the delivery of health services to the state's 130,000 Alaska Natives. To read more, visit IndianCountryToday.com and search for the headline, First Lady's Alaska Visit Focused on Tribal Military Health. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Patty Thoahungva. Protecting the Arctic environment. We'll hear what it takes when it comes to understanding the biodiversity there.
We'll speak with the first Iñupiaq Inuit to become a conservation biologist when we come back. Victoria Qutuuq Buschman is Iñupiaq and Inuit. She's a wildlife and conservation biologist. She has lived and worked across the Arctic in an effort to promote how Indigenous peoples fundamentally shape Arctic biodiversity conservation. She is also the first in her tribe to have a PhD in conservation. Welcome, Dr. Buschman.
Hi, good morning, Waflamertak. It's nice to be here.
Let's start with the big picture. How did you get into this field?
It's a long story. So I was raised both in Northern Alaska and in Northern California, and I've spent a lot of time out on the land. I live in a very traditional community, a whaling community, and I've seen a lot of how conservation has affected our peoples, especially conservation that comes from a very colonial perspective. And I decided that I really wanted to learn about conservation and figure out how to do it in Indigenous communities in a way that was more culturally appropriate for us.
Maybe start there. What is culturally appropriate biology, and what are the flaws in colonial biology?
Right, so conservation as a discipline has been around for more than 100 years, and it comes from a very colonial context in the idea that we need to preserve and conserve species and that human beings are separate from our environment. And of course, Indigenous communities, many of us don't feel this way at all. And so this disconnect between people being a part of our environment and a fundamental part of that environment has been missing. So Indigenous communities, especially in the Arctic where I come from, are really connected to the landscape still. We live in places where it's very difficult to get foods that are not so costly. A lot of food comes by boat and by plane, and so it's very expensive. In my hometown in Alaska, a gallon of milk is $11. So we live in communities where we really do need to live off the land, and many people are still hunters and fishers. And we're also engaged in a lot of hunting and fishing that sort of goes against this sort of mainstream idea of conservation, right? We whale and we hunt seal and walrus and all of these species that occupy the sort of the public fascination about the Arctic. And so there's this narrative that conservation is a very particular thing, right? That we save all the animals, that we save all the land. But for us, for Indigenous communities in the Arctic, we feel that we have always been here to steward and care for the land, that we know how to make sustainable decisions, that we're very respectful of the species that we take, of the individuals that we take. You know, where I come from, animals are sort of like our ancestors, our family. And so there is a lot of respect that goes into that. And right now we see also in conservation biology that there's not as much research out there about species as we would like. So we really do rely a lot also on Indigenous knowledge in the Arctic to fill in those gaps, but also to challenge science when we think that the scientific results are actually incorrect.
Well, I saw that firsthand in an Alaska village where reindeer had to be inspected by meat inspectors in Anchorage rather than serving the people locally because of the protocol from the state legislature. It makes no sense in so many ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of policies and laws and management strategies that just aren't adaptable enough for living in the Arctic, but in a lot of remote places, and especially in a lot of places where other Indigenous communities also live, right? We need policies and laws and management strategies that work for us as peoples. Because of course you want everyone to be on board with conservation initiatives. Conservation in itself is not bad as a concept. It's more that it's been practiced in a way that is so against who we are as people, right? So we need to find ways to make sure that conservation and wildlife management and all of these things, protected areas are done in ways that are good for our people as well.
You're in Greenland today, and one of the things I find so extraordinary is how connected the Arctic is. Um, we don't think of that down here in the South.
Right, yeah. So I'm Inuit. I'm Iñupiaq Inuit, and our people span Russia, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, and we all speak dialects of the same language. So we're extremely well connected, but also like the colonial part of suddenly accidentally we're in 4 different countries is very strange. But we do have a lot of connections in the Arctic, and we have a lot of solidarity with other Indigenous peoples in the Arctic, with other Indigenous peoples in Russia, and also with the Sami people who are in Norway, Sweden, Finland, a little bit in Russia. So we all have very similar experiences, even though we belong to 8 different countries.
One of the other interesting things about the Arctic is that some of the international institutions are accepting Indigenous knowledge in a way that's really rare compared to, again, the United Nations or other international organizations.
Yeah, this is incredible. Like right now is really, we're seeing a really big leap, I think, for Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty, particularly in the sciences, because as I had mentioned before, research in the Arctic is rather data deficient, and there's not a lot of people up in the north to do the labor that is required to do really good research. And so a lot of Indigenous communities are taking on those roles and being the people who are on the ground, doing the monitoring, doing the research. Because we've always been here, and that's not difficult for us. It's not so expensive for us as bringing researchers up all the time. And so our knowledge has become a really integral part of research, at least here in the Arctic, where we have so many issues that we need to address, and not necessarily all of the scientific information that we would enjoy or like to have.
As a scientist, how do you communicate with other scientists about how their worldview is, well, let's just say, in error?
Yeah, so it is really difficult. I often get sort of mistaken as a social scientist, and I have to correct that. No, I have all of my degrees are in the natural sciences. I also have one policy degree, but I've never been a social scientist. I just feel that human beings are a necessary part of our environment, and so we can't just remove people from our research and say that we're doing natural science. Like we're obviously a very big part of science, but also, of course, making sure that science and Indigenous knowledge is enacted in a way that, contributes to good policy, to good management, things like that. So I spend a lot of time kind of breaking it down a little bit. It can be a little bit frustrating for me, but sort of reorienting ourselves as researchers towards a more human approach, I suppose, more human dimensions of natural science. Like there's not a single place in the Arctic, with maybe the exception of a few islands in northern Russia, where people are not affected by, the decisions that are made, the research that is done. And so we really need to take that into consideration as we do our work.
Has the lack of data made this more challenging?
Definitely. So I say that our region is rather data deficient, and what I mean by that is that we're learning new things about basic biology every year, new things about different subpopulations of polar bears, walruses, a lot of species that are difficult to study in the Arctic. And so it's difficult to do a lot of these things also by remote sensing, right? So these days we use a lot of technology to help us sort of track wildlife and make decisions for management based on that. But in the Arctic, it doesn't work so well as in other places. So we do have to rely quite a bit on Indigenous knowledge. And there have been many instances where community members have seen the results of scientific findings and said, no, this is incorrect because you are not sampling in the right area. So you're not doing your research in the right place. And that's significant because no matter how much research you do, how much studying you do in a particular area, if you're not in the right area, you're never going to find, you're never going to approach the truth. And so it's really important when community members say, no, we think there's something wrong with this research. Let us help you see if we can identify what might be going wrong. And oftentimes we find that community members are correct. You're sampling in the wrong area. You're looking in the wrong place. You didn't consider this. There's all kinds of things that have come up in research over the last, 50 years that are slowly showing us that Indigenous knowledge really is a fundamental part of research. It's not to be confused with science, but it definitely is of equal, if not sometimes greater value than scientific knowledge in these regards.
Do you think the scientific community is open to that?
I think we're slowly seeing that. Like you had said, the United Nations has become more open to Indigenous knowledge as a part of their processes. The Arctic Council, which is sort of the United Nations of the 8 Arctic countries, has been more open to Indigenous knowledge. We're really seeing that this is now a good time to be forwarding Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous sovereignty as a part of research, but also just general sort of well-being of peoples, because people are finally willing to listen. And I think part of that has to do with we're in a climate crisis. There's a lot of big changes on the horizon and not a lot of information on how that's going to look. And so there's been a really big attention to Indigenous knowledge in the Arctic to help figure out how we're going to live our lives in the next 10, 20, 50 years.
What are the highest challenges in that regard for climate crisis?
So one thing that I really focus on in my research is sort of the aspect of food security that's related to the climate crisis. So in the Arctic, like I had mentioned, we really do still live quite off the land quite a bit. And so we do need to hunt and to fish. And so with the climate crisis, we're seeing that wildlife populations are moving in different directions. They're going to new places. They're showing up in different places. And so we're really needing to adapt to those circumstances so that people can continue to eat and to live healthy, good lives.
Well, and you're seeing it with migration patterns changing and fish moving in different directions already. And that must be unsettling to a lot of the communities you deal with.
It is, and it's usually a primary concern. We might not talk about conservation in the same ways as other communities or other people do, but we talk about conservation in terms of our land is changing and we need to do something about it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buschman.
Thank you. Iñupiaq.
Last week, I talked to our regular contributor, Holly Cook Macarro in Las Vegas. We'll have that conversation when we come back. I'm Mark Trahant, Indian Country Today. Holly Cook Macarro is a regular contributor to our show, and we thought it'd be great to have a conversation here for last week with the National Indian Gaming Association trade show. And we just want to, it's the energy you get from talking in person. Welcome, Holly, this is fun.
Thanks, Mark.
I want to start by, so many people last week were excited to come out and be participating in something. But it also was about how work has changed, how life has changed, and where we go from here.
Yes, exactly. And I think part of what we're seeing here is the attendance and the kind of considerations that tribal leadership are giving now that I don't think we saw before. And in watching how we, for instance, just got the American Rescue Plan passed. And in terms of the largest investment in Indian country, not one in-person live meeting, right? And that was a huge accomplishment, I think, for Indian country. And largely, we had a number of terrific advocates that were there in person on the Hill. But I do think that it's going to allow for more flexibility for tribal leaders, especially in how they have to travel and not travel. And it is always something, we always joke about that. Where is our tribal leader today in terms of that kind of requirement? And the pandemic, I think, has created this new foundation for how we can communicate and talk to both members and folks in the Senate.
It's always been such an amazing paradox because a tribal leader has to get out and go to Washington or state capitals, and yet people at home punish them for that.
Yes, it like I said, it's a common joke amongst us about where's your tribal chairman today, but I do think this is particularly for those that are on the West Coast or Alaska, and those to do just one day of meetings in Washington, D.C. would require 2 full days of travel on either end of that. Now I think with Zoom, it is both going to be a more effective use of tribal resources in terms of travel costs and oftentimes more valuable our tribal leaders' time.
We're also seeing, and here in Las Vegas, it's particularly unique because it doesn't take probably 10 minutes to notice the shortage of workers, whether the long lines in food service or even service in the hotels. Tribes almost have an advantage because of the high vaccination rate and that so many tribal enterprises kept people on.
Yes, absolutely. And and looking around as we reconnect with old friends that we haven't seen in a year and a half, for those of us who do this work and attend these conferences regularly, it is, I was very cautious at first and but then I thought, this is probably the most highly vaccinated group in town. And certainly Las Vegas is starting to wake up a bit. But yes, this is, the health concerns are.
I had the same thought because Indian country in general, it's very close to 70%. But for tribal leaders, I haven't found one who's not. I mean,
yeah, I haven't either. And I think there was I know that HHS, IHS, and their leadership there, they had a concerted effort to engage tribal leaders to set the example early on. I think it helped. I think with that 70% vaccination rate in Indian country is extraordinary. It means collectively Indian country has reached a herd immunity stage. Not that we're all together at once.
Well, I want to shift topics and ask you about some politics. We're starting to get into the year, and I understand tribes basically pulled back and didn't do anything during the meantime, and now it's starting again.
Yes. When I think almost every tribe, casino, gaming operation, and other revenue enterprises shut down immediately, March and April, just like the rest of the world. And so did political giving. And it has now started. Tribes are giving again. That engagement is there. And it's early. There are a lot of races that we are paying attention to. We have to pay attention to Sharice Davids, Congresswoman Sharice Davids. She's still in a district that is evolving. She flipped it from red to blue. She worked very hard and won it, I think, by 9 points the last time, which is terrific in what was a formerly very conservative district. So keeping an eye on those. They are raising the money. Tribes are paying attention. And there's so much at stake in these midterms. We see this week, so just today, Senator Schumer has teed up the infrastructure bill. Odds are not looking great. I expect that may be delayed. We've also got the budget that's coming up, which is going to have what we expect to be good numbers for Indian country as well. And so the Democratic messaging is, this is our opportunity for historic change. This is a once in a lifetime historic opportunity. So that's what's at stake in the midterms, because the Democrats who control all 3 chambers very much feel as if certainly the Senate is at stake.
Well, and even in that 50 majority in the Senate, 2 votes could make a huge difference right now, and a pickup of 2 would be a landscape change.
Yes, absolutely. And we're having those conversations about things that matter in Indian country, like the Voting Rights Act. And can we do that? you know, we get closer, these races get tighter, it's going to put more pressure on things like doing away with the filibuster. That noise level is rising, the frustration level is rising with the inability to pass pieces of legislation like that. It is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to lay that federal foundation for protecting voting rights.
One part of this election that's already interesting is a Republican fratricide, where they're going after each other, basically for or against Trump. And I just saw today that the Liz Cheney wing of the party has raised more money than anybody thought possible.
I didn't see that. And I find that very interesting because the opposite has been true about those who didn't vote to certify the election. They've raised a lot of money, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world. And so there's energy on both sides just within the Republican caucus and how that's going to raise up. We saw that a little bit on the Democratic side when there were threats from, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez about primarying folks who weren't supportive enough. But I think they've backed down from that. So it will be interesting to see the Republican fratricide.
Well, and we only have about 30 seconds, but the amazing thing about the Democrat side is that even the progressive wing and the mainstream wing came together.
Yes, and just in the last few days have said, we are not the Tea Party. We are not going to kill good legislation because it doesn't pass our purity test. So holding together.
Holly Cook Macarro, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news, go to IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Mark Trahan.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing
This is Indian Country Today.